Okay, it's 9:30. It's time for us to begin. I want to welcome everyone to our morning Bible class here, and we are winding down our study of the divided kingdom. I was making the observation that I think that this study in many ways has been quite beneficial for me personally, just because of the kind of digging and particularly with respect to historical context, and I have become, I think as I've gotten older, more a student of history, and particularly ancient history, which is really fascinating. And so in light of that, it does give some context to what we're looking at with respect to these different kings who we've been looking at. But there's been another element to it that also I think is interesting, and that is in light of the situation that we are in. I've learned to deal with new technology. I remember the first time that Chris and I were doing the Wednesday class, thinking, here's a camera that's on me. It's just me and Chris, and thinking this camera's on me. And there is this process in my mind. I remember when I was in high school, we were on television for one period of time when our football team had the different captains go to this particular event, and we were on TV, and I got froze up by the camera. It just scared the daylights out of me. And that's what happened when Chris and I were initially beginning this. And I began to realize that there's probably only about 40 people that are actually looking at this. So it became more of an awareness that not everybody is interested in what our Bible class is all about, but the people who are part of this congregation are interested in it. And so it helped me then to back down my anxiety and my trepidation, to realize the fact that I am not being broadcast to thousands of people, unless they want to watch it. And of course, when you look at the analytics that's on YouTube, it's interesting because only about 30 or 40 people look at it all of the time. So it's basically you people and whoever else is from the congregation who is not yet made it out who are watching this. So it makes it a little bit easier for me to realize that I don't have to be afraid of a camera. But that's another element that's been involved in all of this. So, and then on top of that, sitting and teaching, that's been something that's been a little bit different for me too as well. And in fact, I was telling Pat this morning, I kind of like it. That even after I heal from all of this, I still might just take a seat up here because it's just kind of interesting. It seems to be a little bit more casual for me. So anyway, these are some of the things that I've learned through what we've been going through. And we're going to wrap up on Wednesday. We're going to wrap up our study of the divided kingdom. Today, what we're going to be doing is looking at the title of it is called The Last Days of Judah, and we're going to be looking at three of the kings who were involved in all of that. And we're going to study about how Judah continued this decline. In fact, how the decline is actually becoming accelerated at this particular period in their history. So that's where we are, and hopefully our study will be beneficial to us. We're going to begin with a word of prayer, and I've asked Cody, if he would, to lead us in that prayer.
Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this time that we can come and worship, learn more about your word. Lord, pray that you would be with Tom through this hour, that he might take what he has studied and help us understand more about your kingdom, more about the divided kingdom of Judah, and that we would in turn, learn from their mistakes, learn from the things in which you took them away from their land. We just pray that we could learn more about you, about what things that we can do to better glorify your name. Your son's name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Cody. Okay, now as we noted in our last lesson on Wednesday, one of the things that I pointed out to you is that Josiah was the last of the kings that were considered to be good. And in fact, he was probably one of the best, if not the best king that Judah actually had because of his commitment to the Lord, his dedication to doing the will of God, and particularly the drive that he had to see to it that not only he, but also his kingdom would also be loyal to God through the covenant that they had made. And I think particularly that's demonstrated that when they had found the book of the law, that there was a covenant that he himself committed himself to, and he gathered all of the people of Judah together and had them commit to this covenant too as well. So he was an extremely good king as far as his relationship with God was concerned. But having died, what happened is that from him passing from now this historical period of time in Israel's history, what also died was the hope of Israel. At least it seems to be on its last leg, if not dead altogether. And so with his death, what it did is it accelerated the deterioration and ultimately the destruction of Judah. And after Josiah died, it is only now 23 years that the kingdom is going to become non-existent. So we're talking about, after his death, a little over 2 decades. So it sped up quite quickly, and it did so in a way that ultimately brought down the kingdom of Judah altogether. And we noted that it was because of Josiah's determined sort of action to oppose Pharaoh Necho's effort to form an alliance with the Assyrian Empire that his death came about. And it was an untimely death because he only died at the age of 39. He started ruling when he was 8 years old. He only ruled for a period of 31 years, and so he died at the age of 39. He was a young man, and in that death, it was something in which Pharaoh Necho killed him because of a conflict that Josiah actually initiated. Necho didn't initiate it, but Josiah did, and in so doing, it brought about his untimely death. But what was also true is that even though he experienced that particular tragedy in his life, he was spared the greater tragedy of seeing the ultimate death of his nation. And God had told him that that would take place through that prophetess Huldah, who had told him that he would go to his grave in peace. And I suggested to you the idea is not that he would have a peaceful death as much as it was that he would be at peace with God when he went to his grave. And that is exactly what happened. So with Josiah no longer in the picture now, what happens is that the situation of Judah begins to change. And it begins to change very quickly, which is what brings us to our study this morning. And so with Josiah gone, the last 4 kings that arose after him put Judah back on the fast track to this deterioration and ultimately to this destruction that they experienced at the hands of the Babylonian Empire. And the 4 kings, 3 of them we're going to be looking at this morning, but of the 4 kings, 3 of those are actually Josiah's son, or his sons, and one of them is his grandson. And so what we will see is that it doesn't go very far past the lineage of Josiah, it just goes to his sons, and that's ultimately it, and then the one grandson who didn't rule for a very long period of time. But what happened is that they undid all of the good that Josiah had accomplished during the period of time in which he reigned, during that 31-year period of time. And ultimately, it brought about the end of the kingdom itself because of the way these last 4 kings ruled. So it's going to be our purpose in these last 2 lessons, in the lesson this morning and then on Wednesday, to look at the lives of these kings. And we're going to be lives of Kings Jehoahaz, Jehoiachin, or Jehoiakim first, and then Jehoiachin. And once again, I think we need to know a great deal that is recorded in the Scriptures about these men. There is quite a bit that is outside of biblical texts. In other words, there is extra biblical sources that you can go to, and you can learn a lot about the history of what was actually taking place during this period of time. But when you look at the biblical text itself, particularly 2 Chronicles, we're only dealing with about 6 or 7 verses of all 4 of these kings. And when you look at 2 Kings contains a little bit more information, but not a great deal more. So a lot of the information that is acquired as far as what was happening during that period of time is taken from extra biblical sources. So what I want to do is to begin then with some historical observations to put this into a context, and then we'll get into the questions and start thinking about these kings themselves. But I want to begin, as I said, with some historical observations, particularly as it surrounds the geopolitical situation of the day. Now, you will recall that by this period of time, the once powerful Assyrian Empire was weakening. And one of the things that is true in all of history is that when one great powerful kingdom begins to wane in its power, what invariably winds up happening? Okay, that kingdom's going to fall under, but does That's right, somebody else rises. In other words, a vacuum is created as far as the geopolitical situation is concerned, and vacuums, by definition, are screaming to be filled. And so with Assyria on the decline, what that means is that there are other geopolitical situations that are true to the ancient Near East at this particular period of time that were also developing in order to be able to fill the vacuum that the Assyrian Empire was leaving as a result of their weakening and ultimately their being destroyed themselves by the Babylonian Empire. And what you find, and I think it is at least implied in the biblical record, that the weakened state of Assyria created this dynamic in which the empire of Egypt, which, again, if you're familiar with the history, is down to the south and to the west of Israel or of Judah, the kingdom of Egypt, under the rule of Pharaoh Necho, recognizes an opportunity here. Well, what also is happening is that there is the rising of the Babylonian Empire under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar. And they, of course, would be to the north and to the east of Israel. And I think it was Cynthia that made this observation in our study last week, or last Wednesday, that what you have, when you look at just at the geography of the area, you have to the north and the east, this would be the opposite if you guys are looking at me, so I'll put it this way. To the north and the east, you will have Babylon. And then down here in the southwest, you have Egypt. Who's in the middle? Judah is smack dab in the middle of all of this. And we have to remember that Judah lied within this area of which there was this enormous trade route that connected, basically it connected the African continent with the European, or not the European, but the Asian continent. And so there is this trade route that is extremely volatile as well as extremely important. And so what you have then is Egypt, who is in the south and the west, who recognizes that there's an opportunity here for them to be able to experience or to flex their muscles. And you have Babylon, who is in the north and the east, who also recognizes that there is this vacuum and they can invariably flex their muscles. And so what winds up happening is that both Egypt and Babylon are seeking to fill the void that Assyria is leaving. And whenever you have two great empires like Egypt and Babylon who are fighting in essence for the same thing, what you're going to have is conflict between these two empires. And that is exactly what took place. And so what we see at this particular period of time in the history of the ancient Near East is actually a power struggle that is going on between the Egyptians and the Babylonians. And what we need to be impressed with, I think, more than anything, as far as our context and what we're seeking to understand about the kingdom of Judah, particularly, is that the geopolitical situation of the day was something that was extremely volatile, and every smaller kingdom that was in the area was affected by this volatility, including Judah, and perhaps even especially Judah, because they are smack dab in between the growing strength of Babylon and what ultimately is the waning strength of Egypt. But there is nonetheless this conflict that continues to go on, which then leads to the point, well then how did all of this come to affect Judah as far as this geopolitical situation was concerned? Well, we noted in the studies that we had on Josiah, both last Wednesday and last Sunday as well, that Josiah, sensing the weakened state of Assyria and recognizing that there is this growing strength of Babylon, what Josiah does is he gets wind of the fact that Necho, that is Egypt, is coming up towards Babylon, and they are coming up there for the purpose of actually allying themselves with Assyria in order to be able to do what they could to restrain this growing strength and this domination of the Babylonian Empire throughout the ancient Near East. And what we noted at that time is the fact that Egypt was heading towards the Euphrates River. That's the area where Babylon would be located. They were headed towards the Euphrates River to help Assyria. And at this point in history, and this is where you get the extra biblical sources that kind of help understand what was going on, at this particular point, Assyria had already lost their capital to the Babylonian Empire, and that was the city of Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is an important city because when you think about, like for instance, the prophet Nahum, he's the one who prophesied about this, what would eventually happen. And it did happen. Nineveh was finally conquered by the Babylonians. Well, what that did is that initiated Assyria to set up what they characterized as a provisional capital, which was the city of Haran, which is located right up there on the Euphrates River, and it was very close to this town known as Carchemish. And in order to get there, that is for Egypt to get up there, in order to be able to form this alliance with Assyria and do what they could to try to restrain the Babylonian Empire from gaining any more strength, what Egypt did is they took the easiest route, which required that they travel through Judah, particularly through the valley of Megiddo. And the valley of Megiddo, it's an interesting historical place because there were all kinds of conflicts that were fought here. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that when you look into the book of Revelation, for instance, and you read about the Battle of Armageddon, Armageddon comes from the concept of Megiddo. And what it was suggesting is this idea of a constant conflict. And that's what happened in the valley of Megiddo. It was always an area in which conflicts would take place. And the reason for it is because, first of all, it was a valley, and second of all, it's a place where all of this travel would go through in order to be able to bring about this trade route. And so what winds up happening is that going through the valley of Megiddo, which is within the territory of Judah, as we noted, Josiah, having gotten wind of that, he takes his army, and he is going to go and he's going to stand against Egypt, doing what he could to stop Egypt from teaming up with the Assyrian Empire. And so he goes to war against Egypt. And we had talked a little bit about why it would have been that he felt compelled to do this. Because again, it's important to note, Egypt did not start this conflict with Judah. Judah started it with Egypt. Josiah took it upon himself to do this without the direction of God. And in fact, we had noted how it was that Pharaoh Necho had told him that God was the one that told him to go and have this battle. But yet, be that as it may, Josiah continued in his way of standing against Egypt, and there were at least two reasons we suggested as to why he would have felt compelled to do that. Do you remember what those two reasons were? One of them surrounded Egypt itself. What was Israel's history with Egypt? That's right. They had been slaves in Egypt for a period of 400 years. Egypt was always a thorn in the side of both the divided kingdoms, both Judah and Israel. They were a thorn in the side of the United Kingdom. And so you have this dynamic that existed with respect to the fact that Josiah would have just felt compelled to go up against Egypt because Egypt was their perennial enemies. But then on the other hand, you also have Assyria. And what do you think would have been Josiah's attitude towards Assyria? That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. So Assyria is recognized by Josiah as a real problem too, because as Dave has pointed out, what happened was Assyria had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, but they weren't content with that. They had come actually into the territory of Judah. They had actually ransacked some of the cities that were actually fortified, and they put up a siege against Jerusalem itself during the reign of King Hezekiah. And as Dave pointed out, had it not been for the intervention of God, they probably would have conquered Jerusalem even at that time. So there is this bad blood between Judah and Assyria, as well as the bad blood between Judah and Egypt. And so Josiah, with both of these dynamics taking place, he decides he's going to go up and he's going to resist this alliance between Egypt and Assyria by doing what he could in order to be able to try to stop it. And of course, what wound up happening is that it cost him his life. And what it also did is he couldn't stop it. Egypt eventually did go up and had this alliance with Assyria, and the battle was engaged in. And so once Egypt arrived at this battle scene, which would have been up around the Euphrates River in what was known as the Battle of Carchemish, which, as I pointed out to you on Wednesday, is one of the most famous battles of ancient history. What happened was that Assyria by the time Egypt got there, let me first make this observation. By the time that Egypt got there, Assyria was pretty much decimated. Babylon had really been successful against the Assyrian army. And so when Egypt's army gets there, what they do is they ally themselves with what is left of the Assyrian army, and then together, the Egyptians and the Assyrians in this alliance, they fought against Babylon in this battle that is known as the Battle of Carchemish. And do you remember the outcome of that battle? Who won that conflict? Babylon. And they won it decisively. And so Egypt, having been defeated, is now heading home with their tails essentially tucked between their legs. And although they were diminishing in their power as a very significant geopolitical power within the ancient Near East at that time, they still exercised a modicum amount of power within the ancient Near Eastern geopolitical situation. They didn't have quite the strength that they once had, but they still nonetheless were a kingdom or an empire that is still to be reckoned with. And due to Josiah's failure to stop Egypt from helping Assyria, and then with Josiah's subsequent death, Judah then was weakened to the point that now what happened is they became a vassal state, first of all, to Egypt, and thus, whether they liked it or not, that is, whether the kingdom of Judah liked it or not, they became a player in the volatile instability that was ravaging the ancient Near East at this time. And so if you look at, for instance, if you were to look today at the modern ways of what is going on in the ancient Near East, or in the Near East now, there is always conflict over there for some reason. It has always been that way. And that's one thing I think that a lot of times, I could tell you a joke, but I'm not going to. You can ask me about it later, but it's a pretty good joke, and it's clean. But anyway, when we look at what is happening in the ancient or in the Near East today, and you think about the fact, these people, can't they get along with one another? Well, the fact is they've never gotten along with one another. There has always been conflict in the Near Eastern parts of that part of the world. And it continues even to this day. It might be a little bit different as far as what the situation is that constitutes their conflicts, but they've always been in conflict. And it was true even back during this period of time. And so due to Josiah's failure to stop this alliance between Egypt and Assyria, they are now placed in an extremely volatile situation as a vassal state of Egypt. And that brings us then to the next three kings who we're going to be looking at. And we're going to start with Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz's record is found in about 4 or 5 verses. It's found in 4 verses in 2 Chronicles 36. It's found in 5 verses in 2 Kings chapter 23. And what is interesting again to me, and I've said this before about some of the other kings, even though there is not a great deal that is said about these kings, what is said about them speaks volumes to us. And so when you look at King Jehoahaz, first of all, how long did this guy reign as a king? For 3 months. That's all. For 3 months he reigns. Now, I want to take you to 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 15. And what we're looking at here, if you've ever read through the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, particularly 1st Chronicles, you have a tendency to kind of get bogged down in what particularly is in the first 9 chapters, because all it is genealogies. That's all you have is just genealogy of the different tribes, and it goes on and on and on, and by the time you get to chapter 9, you're worn out because you've read so much about it. And then you get to chapter 10, and it starts talking about King Saul, and it still is genealogical, but also now it starts including a little bit of history. And it really isn't until you get to around the 10th or even the 11th chapter of 1 Chronicles that you actually begin to look at historical things that were taking place. Otherwise, it's just genealogies. And so over here in 1 Chronicles, in the 3rd chapter in verse 15 in particular, I want you to note the genealogy that is given that deals with the kings of Judah, and in particular, King Josiah, because Josiah, as I pointed out to you, he actually had 4 sons. at least 4 that are recorded in the genealogy. 3 of them are going to play a significant role in the history of the kingdom of Judah towards its end. But I want you to note here, in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, beginning there in verse 15, it says, the sons of Josiah, and then it mentions the firstborn, whose name was Johanan, and then there is the second, who is Jehoiakim, there is the third, who is Zedekiah, and the fourth one, who is known as Shallum. Shallum is also known as Jehoahaz. And so you have different names for these kings. One of the things we will also see is Jehoiachin was also called Coniah. And that's revealed to us over in the book of Jeremiah. So you have some of these descendants of Josiah, his sons, who go by different names. And some of the names that they were given by the kings of whether it be Egypt or Babylon, who conquered them and changed their names and did so for basically their own political purposes. But what you have here is the sons of Josiah. And again, as I pointed out, 3 of these sons of Josiah were integral in the history of Judah because they actually served as kings. Now, the firstborn son is Johanan. And what is interesting is that there is nothing that is known about this guy. Absolutely nothing. Not even in extra-biblical sources is there anything known about him. But it is clear from this that he had no part in ruling the kingdom of Judah. And so some have suggested that most likely he died much earlier. And there are some scholars, and where they get this idea from is, I suspect it's obviously sources that I haven't delved into. But some have suggested that Johanan actually died during the reign of Josiah. So he is a non-player. He is not in this picture at all. And so now you have this king who we're going to be looking at, Jehoahaz, who is also, as I said, known as Shallum, that is recorded for us over in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. You have Jehoahaz, who is actually the 4th son of Josiah. Now, usually when a king died, who is it that who came into play in as the next king? The firstborn. Okay. Now what is his name? Jehohanan. I don't know why they just didn't give these guys English names. But anyway, his firstborn son, is not a player in all of this. And so you would think, based upon that the next one in line would be Jehoiakim. Now, he is going to rule as king, but he's not going to rule as king for a while. And the third son, Zedekiah, he's the last of the kings that we will be looking at on Wednesday. And so the 4th son, Shallum or Jehoahaz, is the one who is appointed as king. And why that took place, why it was the 4th born instead of, in the order of things, it should have been Jehoiakim, is really unknown, because he is actually the youngest of the sons, at least the youngest of the sons that's recorded in this genealogy, who is elevated to the throne of Judah over his 2 older brothers. And again, why that happened is not known, but for whatever reason, as is indicated in 2 Kings 23, verse 30, and also in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 1, it is the people of Judah who put Jehoahaz in this particular situation. So you have the youngest of the sons of Josiah who begins to rule after Josiah was killed, and that brings us then to his reign. And how is it that not only his reign, but all of these kings, how is their reign characterized? Okay, it was considered to be evil, and in fact, in every instance, you will see this phraseology where it says that they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so, very much unlike their father Josiah, they were more like all of the other kings of Judah who were wicked kings. And so there's not a great deal that is said about Jehoahaz because he only ruled for a period of 3 months. But how did his reign finally come to an end? What happened to him? I'm sorry? Okay, he was taken to Egypt by Pharaoh Necho. Okay, now why is that all happening? Again, let me paint this picture for you that the Bible implies but it doesn't really go into great detail, and some extra biblical sources do help us to understand why this took place. And so what happened is after the Battle of Carchemish, when Egypt had been defeated, Egypt is on its way home, and they are returning as a defeated empire. And so during this period of time, as they are retreating back to their home, Jehoahaz was summoned to come to what was known as a temporary base of operations at the town of Riblah, which was located in Syria. And in fact, in 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 33, it talks about that city, where it says there, "And Pharaoh Necho put him in bonds at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, and laid on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold." And so what he did is he summoned Jehoahaz to this town known as Riblah, again located in Syria, which would be on the eastern side of the Jordan River. They are sort of on their way home. And it was at this time, after ruling for only a period of 3 months, that Jehoahaz was deposed by Necho as he asserted his power over the kingdom of Judah. And now the question is, why would he have done that? Do you have any thoughts as to why that might be the case? There is, again, extra biblical evidence as to why this took place. But I'm just wondering if you could figure out why it would be that here he is, he's been whipped at Carchemish. And so he's retreating back home. And on his way home, he calls Jehoahaz into his presence, and he deposes him, and even takes him back to Egypt. You have any thought about why that would have taken place? Well, let me point out to you that what happened here is a little bit of revenge. Revenge on the part of Pharaoh Necho. And so basically, it is retaliation for the conflict that Josiah had initiated earlier. Because if Josiah had not gone into battle against Egypt originally, then they could have hurried on up there, and they may have actually been able to initiate or engage in the conflict with Assyria before their army had completely been decimated. So Josiah essentially slowed Egypt down. And now they're whipped. And so they're coming back, and what Necho does is he takes out his revenge against Judah by taking their king, Jehoahaz, who only ruled for a period of 3 months, and he takes him back to Egypt. And what he also does is he turns Judah essentially into a vassal state. So he is requiring all of this tribute now that Judah is to pay to Egypt in order to keep Egypt from continuing to be just a source of suffering for them. Cynthia?
Well, also, it would have been kind of embarrassing for the Pharaoh to go home empty.
Yeah. Okay.
So he took home second prize.
Okay. All right. And Judah's weak at this point, so he could do that. Yes, go ahead, Brian. Mm-hmm. Right. 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 And I think that that's more so what has happened here. Because if they have Judah as their vassal state, then they still control that area. And so that continues to offset the influence of Babylon towards Egypt. And so Judah becomes kind of like a buffer between Babylon and Egypt. So that now Babylon is going to have to be in constant conflict with Judah before they ever get to Egypt. And what we will see is that Nebuchadnezzar, he's not done with Egypt. He's going to chase them all the way down to the what is the border of Egypt and Judah. So he's going to head pretty much into Egypt itself, as we will point out and as we will see. He doesn't really succeed in all of that, but getting back to why he would have done this in the first place, again, it centers around what was happening in the geopolitical situation of the day. And so Babylon is growing in power. Egypt, Assyria is pretty much decimated at this point. Egypt has been whipped, and they're heading home, but they're heading home in order to be able to just kind of regroup. And in order to do this, they have to once again go through Judah, and they take Judah as a vassal state, taking Jehoahaz back. And what winds up happening is that he then appoints his own king, who is going to be ruling there in Judah for that particular period of time. And I think that part of this, too, is the fact that he is trying to discourage Judah from ever doing again what his father Josiah had done. And so in order to drive home his point, what he does is he takes Jehoahaz back to Egypt with him in bonds where Jehoahaz died, and he appointed his older brother, brother by the name of Eliakim, who is known as Jehoiakim. He appointed him as the king of Judah, but now with the understanding that Judah is subservient to Egypt. And so here in 2 Kings chapter 23, beginning there in the, let's see, what verse do I have? Beginning there in verse 34, it says, "And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the place of Josiah his father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz away and came to Egypt and died there." Verse 35 says, "And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give the money according to the command of Pharaoh. He exacted silver and gold of the people of the land from everyone according to his assessment to give it to Pharaoh Necho." So Judah now essentially has become a vassal state, and they will continue in that way for a short period of time until ultimately they are destroyed as a kingdom altogether. So that brings us then to Jehoiakim. Jehoahaz has been taken back to Egypt by Necho. This is where he ultimately dies. And Jehoiakim now is king, and he has been appointed not by the people. He has been appointed by Necho himself. So he is the one who is now ruling. And how long did Jehoiakim rule? He ruled for a period of 11 years. Of all these last few kings, he was one who had one of the longest rules. Zedekiah also ruled for a relatively lengthy period of time. I think his rule was about 11 years as well. So he did rule for a certain period of time that was, well, much longer than the 3 months that his brother Jehoahaz had had. And so now, of the 4 sons born to Josiah, now the second born is the one who is ruling as king. And of all of the kings that followed Josiah, none of them were good, but Jehoiakim was probably the worst. And the only reason why I say that is because he's the one that ruled the longest. And he would have been the one who would have been, therefore, the worst. And so his reign is characterized just like his brothers, in that he is considered to be one who did what was evil also in the sight of the Lord. Now it's important, I think, to remember that during his reign as king, the kingdom of Judah, at least initially, was serving as a vassal state to Egypt. And he was put on the throne by Pharaoh Necho after he had deposed his brother Jehoahaz. But that period of subservience to Egypt, that is, serving as a vassal state to Egypt, only lasted for 8 of the 11 years that he ruled as king. And as we will note a little bit later on, 3 of those years, he is going to be a vassal to Babylon. And in fact, I would note this with you, and we'll come back to this a number of times. 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 1, it says, "In his days," talking about the days of Jehoiakim, "Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years." And then it says he returned and rebelled, then he turned and rebelled against him. So, the period of time in which Jehoiakim is ruling, he is a king in a vassal state that is subservient, first of all, to Egypt. And then the last 3 years, he becomes subservient as a vassal state to Babylon. And it's also interesting, I think, to note that during this period of time, there is evidence that is given to us from at least Jeremiah that God still kind of held out hope that Judah might repent of their wicked ways. In fact, that was one of the questions, and I just answered it for us. What does Jeremiah 36, 1 through 3 indicate about God's attitude towards or his hope for Judah? I want you to turn over to Jeremiah 36. And one of the things I would point out to you is that when you're reading through the prophet Jeremiah, remember Jeremiah actually began his prophetic work in the 13th year of Josiah's reign. And so he is prophesying during a period of time in which Josiah has been very successful as a king, and now he is going to watch the demise of this kingdom of Judah. And so he is the one who is prophesying during the period of time in which Jehoahaz and now Jehoiakim and even Jehoiachin and Zedekiah will rule as kings. Jeremiah is during this period of time. And that, I think, helps to set the context of the whole study of the prophet Jeremiah, because you understand the political situation that was going on at the time. So here in chapter 36 of Jeremiah, verses 1 through 3, it says, "In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Take a scroll and write on it all the words that I have spoken to you against Israel and Judah and all the nations from the day that I spoke to you, from the days of Josiah until today." And why does he do this? Because it says in verse 3, "It may be that the house of Judah will hear all the disaster that I intend to do to them, so that everyone may turn from his evil way, and that I may forgive their iniquity and their sin." And what that does is it indicates that God is still holding out hope for the nation of Judah. Now, if you're familiar with Jeremiah 36, what wound up happening with that scroll? Okay. And the picture that you get is that Jehoiakim is in his home, a home where royalty would have been. There's a fire that is burning in the hearth. And the scroll is being read to him. And as he goes apparently from page to page, he takes a penknife and he cuts it. And he throws it in the fire. And then, what does he want done with Jeremiah? He wants to get him. He wants to get rid of Jeremiah. And in fact, that's what is indicated there, I think, in verse 26, where it says, "The king commanded Jerahmeel, the king's son, and Seraiah, the son of Azrael, and Shelemiah, the son of Abdeel, to seize Baruch, the secretary," that is the secretary of Jeremiah. He's the one who actually wrote out the scroll under Jeremiah's dictation. But as it says, he wanted him to seize Baruch, the secretary, and Jeremiah, the prophet, but the Lord hid them. So here you're seeing Jehoiakim's attitude. Now, what God is hoping is that Judah's going to repent. But not only do they not repent, but because of Jehoiakim, things only get worse. Because he takes and systematically is cutting up the scroll that had been written and burning it. So that shows his attitude towards the will of God. Okay, so now you're seeing a little bit about the nature of Jehoiakim and the kind of man that he was. And so what happened is that it indicates that Judah refused to repent. And it only brought more suffering and more misery into their lives as a result of God's judgment for their sinful behavior. And although his brother Jehoahaz, who ruled for the 3 months, was truly a wicked king, Jehoiakim's rule lasted 11 years. And during this 11-year period, it's been observed that his reign was marked by a return to idolatry and the king's persecution of the prophets. And then I gave you some verses to consider, and that's what question 4 was all about, to consider some of the horrific things that Jehoiakim did. And we don't have time to look at that because we only got about 3 or 4 minutes left. But one of the things I do want to point out is that he levied enormous taxation. He plundered and pillaged his own people in order to be able to get these taxes. He stood in opposition to the prophets, and he shamelessly destroyed the written word of God dictated by Jeremiah, and then he sought the lives of both of them. And so his reign ended in a rather kind of dubious sort of a way, I would say, because what happens is that after the final defeat of the alliance between Egypt and Assyria at the Battle of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar continued his aggression against Egypt for years, all the way to the Brook of Egypt. And that's indicated in 2 Kings 24 in the first 7 verses. And what he did, what Babylon did, is they took all of Egypt's territory, including the territory of Judah. And so having accomplished this, Judah now becomes a vassal state to Babylon. And Jehoiakim wasn't happy with this. but he had no choice. And by the way, this happens around 606 BC. And I would tell you that there are 3 dates that are critical to remember in understanding the downfall of Judah. 606 is the first one, which is this particular occasion. The second one is 597, when Jehoiachin becomes king. And then the third one is 586, when finally Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar during the reign of King Zedekiah. But let me back up and just simply say, with the last minute or two that we have, this conflict between Babylon and Assyria, or Babylon and Egypt, was something that resulted in a stalemate. In other words, they went as far as to the brook of Egypt, but they couldn't go any further. And so they're in this constant conflict. Both of the armies are decimated. And Jehoiakim gets the idea that now I can rebel against Babylon because they've been weakened. And that's what is indicated again in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 1. He rebels against Babylon. And that creates a massive retaliation on the part of Babylon. And this is where Jehoiachin comes into power. Now, we're going to have to stop here because our class time is done. We'll pick it up here at this point, and we'll look at both Jehoiachin and Zedekiah in our next study as we bring our study to its conclusion. But again, I hope that you're seeing the dynamic of what is happening here. And it is all because Israel, Judah, will not repent. Their kings are taking them down this road to destruction. All right, so with that in mind, we will pick it up on Wednesday and finish our study of the divided kingdom.